Okay. First, I just want to thank June and Robert for creating this just incredible space, this amazing community, and how wonderful to be asked to give a talk and to be able to give something back to this just incredible Sangha and group of people. I'm going to start with a quote that I probably have read more than any other quote in my work. And I forgot to bring it, so I just wrote it out of my memory thinking that maybe it's close enough. I wonder if you ever change human beings with arguments alone, either by blowing them up with great guns of truth or peppering them with sharp facts. You scare them, but you change them. For when you argue with a person, you somehow make them less and yourself more. But when you try to understand them, when you try to like them, how eager are they then to know the truth you have? There's nothing in the world that people so much thrive upon, feel rosy and robust upon, as being loved. Someone named David Grayson, who I actually heard was a right-wing fundamentalist, but I have range. You know? Which in some ways kind leads me to what I'm here to talk about. It's really become my life's work. And I didn't realize it was my life's work until I was probably 25 years into it. But I began in 1976 as a special education teacher, working with kids who had challenging behaviors, and that was in a public school. And then I wound up becoming principal of a day treatment center for kids that were expelled because of their behavior. And simultaneously, from the beginning, I realized I needed to learn something about families and how to work with families. Because so often I found that the kids who were identified as the problems were actually the strongest members of those families. And so much of what interacts and takes place within these families really foster and encourage the very behaviors you would think you would be trying to extinguish. And so understanding systems and being able to recognize how systemic dynamics work became fascinating to me. And so in my movement into becoming a family therapist, one of the things that became very clear to me, when you begin to look on a level of community and on the level of the global community, you know, let's take a look, and again, it's one of the things we don't have to spend much time on, but when you think of the global community, how people get along, how we function, just even on a national level, I mean, there is so much struggle and anger and reactivity that it really became clear to me in seeing the way that the world functions and then to really begin to see how families function. It became very clear to me that when you start looking at global communities and start coming into regional communities and then start coming into more local communities, that really when you start looking at the very first community that we all begin in is the family. That for me, it is the seeds of what we see on a much larger scale. And that realization to me that there, and I truly believe this, that there's never really going to be a world peace until there is family peace. And I can tell you, there are too many families that are not peaceful. They could be very well intended, but there are so many of the dynamics that take place in these families actually wind up fostering many of the problems that you see as you move up the line of different communities. And so this has become my life's work in the sense that I want to contribute to world peace one family at a time. And I have gotten old enough that I can say that I have worked with thousands of families at this point. And it has really come down to some very basic principles that are pretty much descriptive of many of the families that struggle. In fact, people don't really struggle in families dramatically differently. And it's the same thing for families that thrive. There are very simple principles that seem to operate. Everyone has different stories, there are different events, there are different situations, but in terms of the dynamics of how people interact with each other, there are some very basic pieces that I've learned. And I joke with my clients, I say basically, in about 15 minutes I've told you everything I know. It's distilled down to that kind of simplicity for me. And so some of the things I'm just going to throw out here, and what I really like is that we can get into a conversation, that I'll throw out some things, and I just like to have some discussion about this. So on the most basic level, and again, I'm going to be speaking very simplistically. I like that. Sometimes people say, that seems too simple, and I always respond with, well, how complicated do you want it to be? And I like to keep it simple. And so I have kind of reduced this to that there are two kinds of relationships. There are emotionally driven relationships, and there are principle-driven relationships. Emotionally driven relationships are reactive. They are basically triggered by events so that an occurrence takes place, and then there is an emotionally driven reaction. These relationships basically are dependent on whether there's a problem in the day, so there's an inconsistency, and so they are very reactive. Then there are principle-driven relationships. In a principle-driven relationship, people are basically recognizing very consciously and very deliberately that there are principles that they want to be the umbrella over all of the interactions within the family. And that takes skill. If you have the principles of kindness, love, and respect as the principles that you want to guide your family, then those are the overriding approaches to any of the issues that you face, because all families have issues. And so the difference between a principle-driven relationship and a emotionally or event-driven relationship is the difference between a reaction and a response. And the difference between a reaction and a response is reflection. So when you have an emotional surge, because let's face it, people can become angry, that when you have a surge of emotional reactivity, I call it having an emotional circuit breaker. And this requires people to become very conscious, very deliberate, very intentional, and what we like to talk about here is very mindful. And so that you are not continually repeating the same reactivity, but you have an ability, and I will say this to all families, that the most important skill, probably the most important skill you can develop, is the ability to stop, to pause. If you keep reacting in the same ways, you keep having the same kinds of experiences. And the other piece that's very important is to recognize in all of this that you shift from believing that other people determine your emotional state, that you are awake and aware that you take 100% responsibility for the ways that you respond or react in a relationship. So in other words, you cannot blame your partner, you can't blame your children, you can't blame other people for making you feel a particular way. So that phrasing, you piss me off, you make me so angry, you hurt me, has to be recognized that you don't do that to me. I choose to respond to you in that particular way. But you are not responsible for the way that I respond. One of the important pieces to recognize is that a relationship is not 50-50. There are these notions in our culture that are not really encouraging this kind of awareness, because people say it's 50-50. A marriage or a relationship is not 50-50. It's 100% and it's 100%. And you are each responsible for your own 100%. Any thoughts, any questions, Comments? Preach. What's that? What was that?
I said preach.
Preach. Okay, I'll get started now. One of my other goals for today was that you would recognize my New York Jewish accent. How am I doing so far? So far. How am I doing so far? Okay?
So Steve?
Yes.
This is basic Buddhist psychology, right? I mean, it is. It's basic Buddhist psychology.
And it's great. And the piece about it, again, is the practice of this. See, I always say that insight is overrated. I get to do some guest lecturing over at the Loyola School of Social Work. And one of the things I start off always is talking about how insight is overrated. I have people that come to me, they've been to many therapists over the years. They've been telling the same stories. In fact, I will tell you that there are more lay people out there that know about psychology than I do. They have read every self-help book. They've read everything. They know this information, but they're not practicing it. And so it's really not about insight here. And so it's really about conscious intentionality, and it's about changing habits, because relationships are habitual, and these patterns form in families that are habitual. They keep repeating, and without interrupting that, it's pretty easy to just keep the same flow. So one of the things that I do with all my clients, for instance, is I talk about the brain and the importance of recognizing your brain's function in your relationships. And the piece here is that you need to alert your brain that you are about to do things differently. So I send people home with this conversation about the importance of alerting their brain, of getting their brain in a heightened state of change, that they think about familiar habits that they have every single day, and to consciously do them differently. So I send people home with assignments like, every morning brush your teeth with your opposite hand. Rearrange the clothes in your dresser drawer. Move your keys into a different pocket. Or put your phone somewhere else differently. The notion is to become awake and aware to change. Awake and aware to interrupt what's familiar. So obviously, it takes a determination and a desire in order to do that. And you know, that shift to you taking responsibility for recognizing the importance of stopping and choosing something different is the same process. As I say, it's the same process of changing in a relationship, because as you're reaching for your socks in the top drawer, the first thing you do is you go for something familiar, then you have to stop, you have to then re-strategize, and then you have to create a new action. And so the ability to do that in a relationship, when you are finding yourself triggered, to be able to stop is essential. If you stop, you offer yourself an opportunity to make a different choice. And that's what we're talking about. One of the key components to this is recognizing that your relationship is much more important than any of the issues. And when you see people struggling in relationships, those issues, who's right, who's wrong, becomes so much the basis for the struggle that the relationship itself is secondary. I know we teach here from the School of Nonviolent Communication. I happen to be lucky enough about 25 years ago to be with 15 people in Marshall Rosenberg in a workshop. And aside from his incredible puppet show, I really recognized and took away pretty much one thing that has stayed with me. And that is the notion that me being kind and respectful to you is not dependent on you being kind and respectful to me. And some people think that means I'm supposed to just take whatever you're dishing out. And that is not really what we're talking about here. I could, in a very kind and respectful way, let you know that right now I feel that I'm being judged. I feel that there's much anger going on here. And from our past, in our experiences, if you play the tape through, I know we never get to a good place with this. The relationship has to be the priority, not the issue. That's an issue-driven, event-driven, emotionally reactive relationship. So this is a key piece to keep in mind, that ability to stop, that ability to pause, and to recognize that you want to do something differently here. I can't change you. I always say you cannot change your partner. You can only change the way you respond to your partner. And that's key. You all with me, huh? Anybody disagree? Yeah, right. So I learned a lot of this because I worked with very challenging behavior with kids. So the idea is learning how to respond differently, because essentially, if you boil it down, people feel wrongly accused, misrepresented, and they want to set the record straight. And they feel very righteous about that and very driven to do that. And many of my examples of how to respond differently when you're wrongly accused comes certainly from the work I did with very challenging behavior in teenagers. I worked with kids at the school that I was principal of. They went up to 22 years of age. And they were big people that had a lot of history of struggle with authority. I mean, they were expelled. And so it became very clear when I got hired to take over in that school, there had been too many what they called therapeutic restraints, which is a euphemism for staff pouncing on kids, right? It's the kids are out of control. The staff is, struggling with the kids. And my approach always had to, which I brought to the school, was that you have to take a look as a staff person as to what is your contribution to the escalation and what skills do you have to de-escalate behavior. And I know we're on camera, so I'll try to tamper down my my language. But so if a teenager said to me, and I had the opportunity to demonstrate this in front of 40 staff when the kids were first coming in after a summer break, and a kid comes out of there and he was in a fight with somebody, and I intervened by just saying, it was called the Gifford School. I said, "Welcome to Gifford," and he turned around and he said, "You're an effing asshole." Everybody understand what that means? Effing asshole? Okay. And and I said to him, "That's important for me to know." I thought I was coming across as someone who really cared for you. And when you tell me that I'm an effing asshole, I am clearly not coming across the way that I want. What's going on here? And it would be amazing when you move in the direction of, it really comes out of the school of martial arts. Somebody throws a punch, you don't meet the punch, you move in the direction. So there are many, many stories when you don't, number one, you don't take it personally. In a relationship, if you keep taking it personally, your emotional well-being is in the hands of somebody else. Sometimes I joke that I should carry my card at the Jewel. I remember years ago, I was watching a mom pushing a 3-year-old who's sitting in the basket, and she's leaning over to this child saying, "Do you want to make mommy cry?" And I'm thinking, wow, that's a lot of power to give to a 3-year-old. But parents do that all the time. You disappoint me, you make me sad. In our culture, there's a lot of fear-based parenting. And the other thing that winds up happening is that it becomes very behavioral. You live in a community like this. It's very much about education. It's about doing well in school. It's about being involved in about 40 different after-school activities. And it's all about behavior. Did you do your homework? Did you do your chores? And what gets lost is the teaching of the principles. It's the teaching at a very young age that a 3-year-old is a very important member of the community. When you give a 3-year-old a spoon to put at the table, and then when everyone is sitting around and it's time for dessert and everybody holds up the spoon to the 3-year-old and looks at the 3-year-old and says, "Thanks so much for the spoon," that you start to teach that within our community, you are an important contributing member of the community. And I think we miss that a lot, of really helping young people, young children, begin to identify the importance of their contribution to the overall well-being of the entire family. Instead, it's reaction. And instead of teaching the principles, for instance, if a child is hitting a brother or sister, we saying, don't hit. But instead of saying, oh, this is an opportunity for me to help you understand that we need to learn something about kindness and respect in this family, and this is what kindness and respect looks like. I always say that a child's behavior is always a window into one of the life lessons this person needs to learn. And when you stay principle focused, and you begin to help children at a very young age recognize that, instead of, if you did your homework, you're good, if you didn't do your homework, you're bad, versus saying, let's talk about responsibility, let's talk about obligations, let's talk about following through with the things that you say, the importance of being truthful. I think that's very important to make those distinctions, to help kids at a very young age begin to recognize that. But then, we have to take a look at the adults within the family. You have to be the people you want your children to be. And the level of hypocrisy, I mean, take a look at our culture. One of the phrases I grew up hearing is, do as I say, not as I do. Children only learn by what they experience. They don't learn by what they're told. When you try to deliver your wisdom through temperament, through anger, through blame, through shame, through intimidation, they don't get you wisdom. They think you're, what phrase did I use before? An effing. That's what they begin to believe. They're not getting your wisdom. Wisdom is not gained when it's rammed down somebody's throat with anger, which is why I like that quote that I read. So I think these are really important pieces to begin to recognize. In relationships, you have to abandon the notion of truths. There are no truths in a relationship. There are perspectives and there are experiences. This is my perspective. If I say to you, you are really selfish, and I hear that, and if my first response is to say, I'm selfish, and I start giving you my evidence why I'm not selfish and why, in fact, you are so off base, we just have conflict. It's escalation. If you say to me that I'm being selfish, and I say to you, again, in the same example I used before, my intention is not to be selfish. And if that's how I'm coming across to you, fill me in. I need to know. And so there's the other concept that I like to teach is the difference between curiosity and judgment. When you learn to be curious, you're going to learn a lot more. Judgment is reacting and saying what you just said to me is no good, is off base, I disagree. And when you watch, for instance, if we watch parents and children fight, one of the things you'll always notice is that the parent gets younger. The parent gets younger. I was in a school system for 12 years in a public school, and I got to tell you, school systems are another area. Now, again, there are some amazing teachers out there, and I'm not, making a tremendous global generalization, but teachers are not really trained to deal with difficult behaviors. Even in teacher training, they get maybe one class, and it is the essence. I can tell you that most of the kids that wound up at my school because when they were little, and I used to get folders this big when I would get a kid who was 18 years old. And from the time they were in first grade, they're being called oppositional and defiant. And this gets passed on throughout their career. And they get molded into in these ways. I remember saying, what if we said that this kid has a very strong mind? This kid has a real desire for what they believe in or something. We had our own story with Teddy when he was a kid. He was oppositional and defiant. And I remember I said that to Ruth. I said, God, that little shit, he's just so oppositional and defiant. And she was so great because she said, well, we can't use that term. So we called him our passion boy. Made all the difference in the world. You reframe something, you give it different meaning, you give it a different opportunity. I do that with couples that are at war. I say, wow, tremendous passion in your relationship. Is there another way you might want to show this passion? But that's, again, this kind of conscious intentionality. And without that, you will just continually repeat over and over again. I always say that people keep using the same strategies over and over again that never work, except more frequently and louder. But it doesn't work. And it will never work. When you hear a phrase, if I've said this 1,000 times, I always say, do you think another 1,000 will do it? And it won't. It won't. People are dedicated to ineffective strategies because they feel right, and they keep arguing about it in the same way. Never changes. And so this kind of awakening, this kind of awareness is just really important to create a thriving family, a thriving relationship. A thriving relationship is deliberately, intentionally created. It's an invention. It isn't like you meet your soulmate and you then just are in bliss. That is not, that doesn't last for 30 years. And so you really do have to be awake with a very conscious desire of what you want, which leads me to something else. So when clients come to see me, I have a form which basically has two questions. Why are you here? And how will you know when you're done? What will be happening differently in your life at that time? Inevitably, people tell me what they don't want. They will say, well, we don't want to fight, we don't want this, and we don't want that. And they go through their whole list in great detail. People will talk about their struggles. They will tell you the time on the clock. They will tell you the temperature in the room. They'll tell you what was on the radio. They'll tell you what was on the counter. And then I ask them, so what do you want? And they're very vague. It's very unclear when you ask people what they really want. The tendency is to define success as the absence of the negative. We want this, we want that, this won't be happening anymore. But when you say, what do you want? They'll say, well, we want to be happy. Well, pretty vague. It doesn't have the same detail of the struggle. People can quote each other to the exact words that were used when they're describing what they don't like. But when it's about designing and creating a vision of the solution, it is very vague. And what's very important is developing a vision of the solution. Because when you have a vision of a solution, you then can construct behaviors and actions that will bring that about. Again, when you're being principally driven instead of emotionally driven, you offer yourself the opportunity to construct different responses versus similar reactions. Anything out here? Anybody want to make any comments? No?
I always like that line about it being like responding where you don't want to go on vacation.
Oh, yeah. Tell it.
I don't know.
Well, it's just what Teddy said. I say to people, when you tell me what you don't want, it's the same thing as saying, I ask you where you're going on vacation, and you say, I'm not going to California. It's the same thing. If you say, if a couple says we don't want to fight, I don't know if that means they want one be in the attic and one be in the basement. I don't know what that means. We'll get along better. I still don't know what that means. It's vague. You want, in the world of solution thinking, they used to come up with the phrase video talk, that you would describe what is happening as if you were watching a video. And so that's really important. There's also the famous miracle question. You say, this one, the famous miracle question would be, if you went to sleep tonight and a miracle occurred and all that you ever wanted took place, but you don't know it because you're asleep, what's the first thing you start noticing in the morning when you wake up? That lets you know that this miracle has taken place overnight. So by identifying what you want and constructing new actions towards that, and the ability to interrupt that impulsive reactive behavior, you increase the likelihood that you are going to start to create the kinds of relationships and experiences that you say that you want.
Two words you haven't used yet. I imagine they're in your repertoire. Listening and patience. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You talk about it.
I can. I think that they're both intertwined.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in hearing you. I'm not interested in hearing me right now.
Oh, Mark. It's all part of being kind and respectful, is to be, again, it goes with the curiosity. For me to stop needing to prove my point, but I take the time and the patience to understand you, that is going to help us as a relationship be able to create something that is more positive for both of us. I mean, the idea is to create relationships that are mutually beneficial. And, you know, when, again, the thing that came out of Marshall Rosenberg's work is the importance of maintaining connection. And connection is broken as soon as people feel rudely treated or disrespected. You immediately are in adversarial positions. You know, some of this, I don't know if it's in his book, but he spoke about that he developed a lot of these techniques to help in negotiations. I think he speaks to that, you know, whether it's a negotiation of someone who's standing on a ledge and wants to jump, or whether it's trying to negotiate peace treaty from a war. And I know that he spoke to a lot of the difficulties in the Middle East with Israel and Palestine about trying to negotiate, that the important piece is maintaining connection. And connection will break when somebody has been dismissed, minimized, criticized. And at that point, the chances of coming up with a successful negotiation is pretty nil. It just doesn't happen. People entrench in their opposing positions. And so, you know, kind of coming back to all of this, in order for families to teach people how to be respectfully angry, some people, when I use that phrase, think it's an oxymoron. How could you be respectfully angry? But you can be respectfully angry. I call it commenting on the process. I could say to you, wow, you know, right now I feel like yelling and screaming at you. I feel like running out of this room. But I know if I do that, we're just going to keep having what we've always had. So I'm going to try to stay in a calmer place and try to understand what's going on here. But I am really, really feeling upset and really angry about whatever it is. I could be respectfully angry. And how do you teach your children to be respectfully angry? You know, certainly yelling, screaming, and smacking them is not going to do that. You know, we have a culture that says, in order for you to take me seriously, I have to be really angry. I mean, if you're not screaming at AT&T about the lousy service you're getting, you don't get to the supervisor or you don't get the action if you're not threatening. But think about that. You know, we do have this piece in our culture that if something is very important to you, you're going to be really upset, or you're going to be really angry to demonstrate that. I've done talks for parent talks, and I talk about spanking and, you know, that kind of thing. And there's various cultures will really embrace, you know, punitive behavior like that. And the response I always get is, if I want my kid to know that they've really crossed the line, then I will spank them. And as if the physical pain, or as I say, the abuse, is going to somehow teach them the lesson. And it teaches them that when you get frustrated enough, you smack somebody. That's what it teaches them, that there is a point at which that's justifiable. And then take a look at the world, and the world culture. I mean, we're reacting all over the place in the same way. I mean, the strife, whether we look, it doesn't matter whether we look at Syria or Afghanistan, we're looking at all of the struggles in this world, it's because people are really not hearing each other. They're not being patient with each other. They're not listening to each other. They are immediately in opposing positions. I mean, I think, you know, we were all facing that with our president and what's going on here, how easy it is to just be very reactive. And it's very easy to, because, you know, we're right, he's wrong. And, I mean, I think we believe that, but how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? So, these are some of the things that I think are important for us to keep in mind, is recognizing this leads me to another concept of the invitation. Everything you say, verbally, and everything you do non-verbally, everything invites the person you're interacting with to experience you in a particular way. I have an office in my basement. I had one client walk in, came down, sit down. He said, I'm not going to see somebody in their basement. And he left. It was really, I'm really glad he left. I mean, if I was here in a three-piece suit and tie, it would invite you to have an experience of me in some way. I'm not even saying whether it be positive or negative, but everything you do and everything you say invites a response. And when you become conscious of what you're inviting, then you have some choices and some chances to be clear what it is you want to be inviting. You're always inviting. Just like you're always communicating. In communication theory, you'll always hear people come in all the time. They'll sit down and they say, we're not communicating. Well, you cannot not communicate. You're always communicating. The question is, what are you communicating? And are you communicating from a place of conscious intention, or are you communicating from an unconscious place? I always say to parents, you're influencing your children. You're either influencing them consciously or unconsciously. You're influencing them in ways you would say you would want, or you're influencing them in ways you would say you don't want. But you're always influencing. And that's an important piece to keep in mind.
Parker,
Yes?
I love the concept, but it really was a light bulb for me when you said relationships are not 50-50, 100-100. So then I'm thinking about, for me personally, what that means is, that means I'm now 100% right. Before I was only 50%. So I feel like it heightens, and I think because through meditation, through this process and practice and intention of being more awake and being and pausing, that I find like I see or I feel those things more intensely.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't always have the most skillful means of communicating them. And so I find like, what do I do with that? Like this kind of enlightenment in some ways. Oh, okay, I'm 100% and you're 100%, but that just gives me even more like kind of energy and the ways that, in good ways, some ways, but helpful or really skillful ways, but also unskillful ways. So how do I unescalate, or how do I de-escalate that part of my process?
Well, see, that though assumes that you're holding on that there's some truth. My 100% is my truth,
Right.
but it's not yours. And so if I'm going to stick to my 100% and insist that your 100% is wrong, we're going to just keep struggling. And so that position of curiosity. And the assumption here isn't that you're always going to agree. The assumption here is that I'm going to recognize that our relationship is important, and that the relationship is more important than the 100% of whatever that is. I mean, I could still believe that, you stole money from me is 100% wrong. But I'm going to get a lot more in our relationship if I sit down and I say, help me understand how that doesn't feel respectful to me, how that breaks trust in our relationship, and the importance of these principles of having trust, of having care, of having respect. I want to say that when you took that money from me, I didn't feel respectful. I respected. I didn't feel, I feel that it broke trust with you. And our relationship is important, and those principles are important for us to have a solid and respectful relationship. So I want to try to understand. Now you may, and if I present it that way, instead of yelling and screaming at you for that, we have an opportunity to create a greater understanding. So that's, one of the ways I would, try to respond to that. But when you get into the I'm 100% right, which means you may be 100% wrong, we're in trouble. And I think that's the piece that you want to be awake to. You still can believe you're right, but that still means I would like to be curious about what your experience is. I was at a party it was before the election, and one woman there was like pro-Trump, and everybody pounced onto her for that position. And I didn't say anything, even though I'm thinking, how could particularly a woman be for this guy? But when all the arguing stopped, I took it to the side and I said, you know what, I don't know people who are for Trump. And I'm curious, what is it that draws you to him? Now, I didn't agree with any of the things she said, but she felt respected, and I wasn't there to change her mind. There's that phrase, about whether you have a dog or not in this fight. I mean, I wasn't going to change her. Right? I was going to blow her up with great guns of truth and pepper her with sharp facts. I wasn't going to change her. But in trying to recognize her perspective, even though it was very different than mine, we at least had a connection, and she appreciated having an opportunity to at least feel heard. Yes?
As someone who's very reactionary and dismissive, both to loved ones and strangers, what's something I can walk away with today to practice when that comes up for me?
Okay, so say it again. What is it that...
Very dismissive and judgmental and reactionary, both towards loved ones and strangers.
Right.
And what's something I can walk away with today? What's something I can practice today?
You could walk away with my card. But
8 sessions.
You wouldn't need 8. The fact that you're aware of that, to start understanding, when do you feel that physically, that surge? I mean, part of this is understanding what happens in your body. There's a sequence. It may feel like it's like this, but for instance, if you wrote a note to yourself on the mirror in the bathroom, in your car, popping up on your phone every hour, that says non-judgment, and at the end of the day, you noticed all the ways you started going down a road of judgment and became aware of that ability to stop, you at least offer yourself an opportunity to recognize how that reveals itself to you. So it requires you, again, to create a new action, because the insight, this is a good example, the insight that I get judgmental and dismissive, that's insight. But it won't change unless you are determined to create new action. The only thing that creates new action is new action. I know that sounds a little silly, but action is what changes. The thing is this: you will act your way into new feeling much more quickly than waiting to feel your way into new action. Does that make sense?
Sure.
You will act your way into a new feeling much more quickly than waiting to feel your way into a new action. I'll say to people, if you're waiting to feel like going to the gym, you're not going to the gym. You go to the gym and you start to receive the benefits of going to the gym, you might actually start to want and feel like going to the gym.
So instead of teasing or judging, what's an action I can take?
Instead of teasing
Or judging or dismissing?
What's an action you would like to take?
Not saying anything.
Okay. And if you're not saying anything, if that was a principle, what would that principle be?
The principle would be principle of acceptance.
Okay, so if you say, I want to practice acceptance today, I'm going to practice. See, if you allow yourself to be, part of the human laboratory of experiment, and you say, I'm going to see what today will be like with acceptance. And so you'll see something, and you might judge it, and you go, oh, no, practicing acceptance. It really is the fake it till you make it kind of approach. That's really important, because if you're treating me respectfully, even though you want to rip my head off, I don't care. You're at least treating me respectfully. We still have a possibility in our relationship. But the more that you practice, the more it becomes yours. I mean, there's a great quote: when you argue your limitations, they become yours. But if you practice your strengths and you practice the kinds of actions, the kind of person you want to be, that will become you also. And that's why, again, going back to the notion how important it is to identify what you want. And it can't be that you want somebody else in your life to be different. There's an interesting article. Well, there's an interesting article written by a family therapist who's well-published, Chloe Madonna. She wrote, it's the 14 Habits of Highly Miserable People. And it's kind of a how-to manual, right? Here's how you can be really miserable. And one of them is make sure that you involve yourself with a romantic partner you want to change. Guaranteed you'll be miserable. Personally, it keeps me in business, though. There are a lot of other nice things, like make sure you find fault with as many people as you can. Make sure you blame your parents for everything. Always worry financially. There's just a great little list, the 14 Habits of Highly Miserable People. And many you'll relate to, and it's pretty accurate stuff. Yes?
One of the things I'm studying right now is Paul Ekman's work on facial recognition.
Oh.
He's kind of categorized people around the globe, including people in not literate countries or like Papua New Guinea. And it's really interesting. And I'm also a physical therapist, so I brought out the muscle charts, and I'm like, okay, which muscles are doing these? And I find I can help change my mood and respond better if I just change my face.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me.
So you're talking actions.
Yeah.
I'm always thinking with my patients, what action are we going to do? But also, what action am I going to do right here?
Thanks, because you just remind me. One of the things I'm always saying to people is that remember your face. Because, think about what it's like when you walk in and you're going to see your partner or meeting a friend. What does your face look like? At the end of the day, one of the things that's very common, some people don't even look up and acknowledge the other person walked into the house. They're, so busy or involved. What happens if you just stop for a moment? In fact, I had a client who used to take the metro out here, and a lot of problems happening in that relationship. And he pretty much did work up until he got off and walked home and was still in his work mode, walked into the house and was still all in his head. And my instructions to him was, one, for him to start remembering his face, but when the train got to a certain stop, he needed to put away his work, and he needed to take a picture that was a favorite picture of him and his family on a vacation or at some happy thing, and he had to look at the picture and start to transition into the fact that he is now becoming a family man. And he even made a little, those little strip, signs over the keyhole that said, remember your face. And by the time he put the key in and walked in, he was sort of like, walking in. And on the other end, I was working with the family. We cued family members also to be aware and awake of what it's like for him to walk in the house, because they all learned to run for cover. And so by just making that shift, it was a dramatic change. Yeah. So this kind of awareness, intentionality, a thriving relationship, again, is something you create. It's not just the luck of the draw that you found somebody who you connected with. That will not sustain. I know I'm repeating some of the things I said, but it's really about recognizing. Sometimes Ruthie jokes. She says sometimes she thinks she's superfluous in this marriage, right?
It's true. It's true. He's decided that he wants to be married to somebody who he thinks is an extraordinary woman. And I'll say, Stephen, it doesn't make any difference what I do. You made that decision.
But it takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, the truth is...
The truth?
The truth is...
You just wiped out your whole
My truth
Okay.
is that Ruthie is an extraordinary person, and it's pretty easy to do it, so... yeah. But... any other questions? Yes.
I'm going to open up a can of worms.
I love that. Go for it.
So you started your talk with sort of maybe in my mind a trickle down chart, right? And your place of mindful action is your unit is the family.
So I was wondering if you could kind of trickle up for us now and help us understand how you see that peace within the family going outward to...
Well, when you grow up in a community in which you learn how to be curious instead of judgmental, when you grow up in a family in which you recognize that being part of a community, there's a responsibility for contributing actions and behavior that benefits the community. When you become aware of that, not growing up in a family, like I said, that's using anger, you're going to be punished if you don't clean up your room. But cleaning up your room is an act of loving kindness to the family. Cleaning up your room is a way that you contribute positively to the overall well-being of the family. And you start to grow up and have those kind of reflections of what it means to be part of a community in which you contribute consciously in a positive way so that the community benefits. If people were coming out of families really learning how to be respectfully angry, to really learn how to be curious about different perspectives, you then can take that into this community, into a larger community. I mean, look how hard it is to get a stop sign somewhere. I mean, but if you can be a respectful person because you actually have that experience. See, the way I see it, it's all about seeds. If people are... If you think of the family as the very first community, and then if you think about the individuals within that community, we're all moving out into the world. And people who tend to grow up in kind, loving, and respectful communities tend to be kind, loving, and respectful people, and tend to bring that. I mean, well, okay, this is a spontaneous community. This is a very supportive, loving, I mean, it's part of the deal here. I mean, if you came in here and you were rude and disrespectful and in some consistent way, we as a community would find a way to probably counsel you out or some way invite you strongly to recognize that this is a community in which acceptance and kindness, metta, is practiced. We as a community can come together to be helpful for somebody, but this is a spontaneous community. You know, I know in here, no matter what I say, no matter what I do, there's going to be a level of acceptance. There's an agreement in this community to be kind and respectful to each other. It's an assumption. And that's a beautiful and wonderful thing. But people tell me all the time in their family, you know, people will treat other people much more kindly than they do in their family, because one of the notions we've grown up with is you always hurt the ones you love. And it's like, why is that acceptable? Why is that the thing? Well, all day long I'm out there holding it together for everyone, so when I come home I let it go. I said, well, you know, maybe you want to think about that. That, yeah.
So I kind of think about, again, at the BNL, only responding once.
Sure.
Because there's strife right now between races, there's strife between people who are, we consider each other different from each other. So this is where this question is coming from.
Sure.
To raise it to this other societal level.
Right.
So I think what's key is if it's the notion of family, it's the question of who do you consider in your community? Who is your community?
Well, how do you
How are you inclusive of everyone in your community as your, you know, looking at them as your family? Interbeing is what we call it, right?
Okay, so the strife, for instance, where do people learn to be leery of a different race? Where do people learn to be to have judgments, the stereotypes? You learn that in families. If you're in a family that makes it a point to teach you about acceptance, to teach you about the differences in people, to teach you about having an open heart, you're more likely to approach that that way. Again, I see it all within the family. How do people in family influence the members of that family? It's still always at that level. You know, again, you know, in my maybe grandiose notion of trying to change the world one family at a time, I get that there are a lot of forces out there. You know, as a species, we're very young on this earth. And when you really watch the way that on a global level people interact, developmentally it's very playground level. I mean, it's a very developmentally very young, the way that people are dealing with each other in a global way. And, you know, I almost think that the more that we start to practice this kind of awareness, that there's going to be a developmental shift in culture to become more aware, more awake. Look what happens during certain catastrophes like earthquakes. Although one of the stories was February 7th, 1978 was Ruthie's birthday. We were in Boston. We had 90-mile-an-hour winds with 36 inches of snow. The week before, we had 29 inches of snow. There were 50-foot drifts across Mass Ave in Cambridge. They had a fly in the army with, it's just incredible. People were knocking on doors. People were making sure people were okay. You saw people out on the street. There was a connection. And then you just watched as the snow melted, people went back to, to their familiar boundaries and distance. But boy, people rise to the occasion. There's an essence in all of us that is really good and really supportive and really encouraging. So the idea is, how do we tweak that so it's happening, you could do things, stop at a stop sign, wave somebody through. They're all forms of acts of kindness that you could be putting out there, but it takes conscious intentionality to do that. Even to shift, when somebody blows the stop sign, instead of coming up with those effing something words, you wind up thinking, wow, they clearly are in a hurry. Or one of the things that we had to practice in my family therapy training was the art of reframe. So that if somebody cut me off in a car, my practice was to say, isn't it great that I'm such a good driver, I avoided that accident? Instead of focusing on them, it was always about, oh, isn't it great that I maintain my car and these brakes work so well? I know inside I felt the tweak, but the intention was to practice coming up with something that was non-judgmental. And after a while, you start to develop that more intuitively. So it goes from a very deliberate action to becoming a new habit. And everything is habitual. And part of this is waking up, what habits serve me and what habits don't. And again, as long as I'm not blaming you for my upset and recognize those are new habits I want to create in terms of how to respond to you in a kinder, more respectful way, I am more likely to become that person, to become the person you want to be. I always liken it to kind of a bonsai tree or some kind of form of landscaping art. You want a tree to grow in a certain direction. You can't just bend that branch. It's going to snap. And so you create leanings and just a little bit of a tightening up until you start to shape a tree into the form you want it. And I think about that for myself and for others, to lean in that direction. So, Matt, if you're putting up a sign to be more conscious of judgment today, and you abandon the notion of perfectionism, because there are no happy perfectionists, that's another whole rap. If you think about it, perfectionism is the ongoing art of self-deprecation. You're never, this notion of perfectionism is, and again, probably the same people that said, do as I say, not as I do. Because it doesn't exist. And in fact, because it doesn't exist, it's interesting that people will describe themselves and try to live like they are perfectionists. And so the awareness of leaning and bending is really important. And I think we're probably getting near the end here. Any final questions or thoughts? Yes.
Do you treat families that the rest of them ain't there?
Yes.
You do?
Yes. I work with a lot of individuals because here's the piece. It's your 100%.
That's right. That's right.
And so very much, I've worked with couples where I'm working with the couple. I have an empty chair. I have them interact. With enough role play practice, we can create what is a familiar dance and still help the individual learn to respond differently in the face of that. And it's true, people need new scripts. The scripts become, very rigid. And to learn how to find these different kinds of responses, it's not natural for a lot of people to know that. They didn't grow up with that necessarily. It's not modeled in a larger community. I know that one of the things that Ruthie and I learned years ago, because we have our other son, Ben, who's been here meditating, he has his special needs. And we went and worked with these people out in Massachusetts. And this kind of attitude about happiness being a choice and this kind of awareness, I remember this, his name is Barry Kaufman, he said to us, well, I'm teaching you how to live like about 1% of the world. And this isn't that you're going to see it so widespread in the world, but again, make it your 100%. And you'll be, I mean, I find that if you smile and say hi to somebody, or you are kind and respectful, that comes through. My other son, Ben, one of the things I always say about him is that he has a way of bringing out the best in everybody. And it's really true. And so there's ways that you invite. And what are you inviting? And I think that's really the piece about conscious intentionality, creating the kind of life and relationships that you want, and to do it deliberately and with intention, not to take things personally. I learned there's a phrase, becoming immune to being offended. When you're offended, you give somebody else the power to determine your experience, your well-being, instead of that curiosity, like that kid that I said, thanks for letting me know. I wanted to be someone that you thought was supportive and caring, and I needed to know that. Clearly, I'm not coming across that way. Yes?
I want to say that I felt that from Teddy when I first met him, bringing out the best in someone. There's
Thank
just
you, Mary Susan.
You have a presence and a love and a care and kindness.
I'm tattered inside. No.
It doesn't take compliments very well.
Yeah, well.
If you'd like to do another workshop, that would be wonderful.
Sure, I would love to do some more. That's great. Probably don't have much more to say. But anyway, maybe I didn't get to all my list here, but that's okay. So, thank you so much. Appreciate it.